Welcome back to Kotow's Officer Basic Course. In this episode, we are going to look at one of the three main defensive tasks, the mobile defense. Defense can be tricky as usually the attacker has the initiative to set the pace of an engagement. The main defensive task can be broken down into three main sets, the area defense, the mobile defense, and retrograde. Today we're going to look at the second example, the mobile defense. Per FM 3-90-1, which will be quoted at length and dedicates an entire chapter, number 8, to a discussion of the mobile defense. The mobile defense is a defensive task that concentrates on the destruction or defeat of the enemy through a decisive attack by a striking force. The mobile defense focuses on defeating or destroying the enemy by allowing enemy forces to advance to a point where they are exposed to a decisive counterattack by the striking force. The striking force is a dedicated counterattack force in a mobile defense constituted with a bulk of available combat power. It continues, a mobile defense requires an area of operations, AO, of considerable depth. The commander must be able to shape the battlefield, causing an enemy force to overextend its lines of communications or locks, expose its flanks, and dissipate its combat power. Likewise, the commander must be able to move friendly forces around and behind the enemy force targeted to be cut off and destroyed. As such, mobile defenses can be highly effective as a tool, but must be applied in the right circumstances to be effective. To illustrate at least the idea of a mobile defense, we'll go over a depiction of it, at least in part, from the 1970 film Patton, featuring the Battle of El Guettar during the North African campaign. Pay attention to the mechanics of the battle and how the Second Corps executed their defense.
They haven't spotted our positions yet.
They'll get an education in about 10 seconds. When they get a dose of that artillery fire. Commence firing. Fire at will.
Commence firing. Fire at will. Commence firing. Fire at will.
Waste of fine infantry.
Sir, I can't raise it.
They can tell him to hit him hard on the right flank. Here's where we hold my nose. Kick him in the ass. Go on. Magnificent bastard, I read your book!
Now, historically, the actual counterattack by the striking force was rather limited, as 2 Corps, and in particular 1st ID, lacked sufficient combat power to maintain the momentum and thereby the initiative to really follow through with the counterattack. However, the film highlights several of the factors that go into the planning and execution of a mobile defense, and I will highlight them as we continue. I'll also leave some links in the description for a few resources if you want to look more into the battle yourself. To re-emphasize, the focus on the mobile defense is not terrain-based, that's area defense, but on destroying the enemy formations. It requires sufficient terrain depth to execute, as well as dividing one's forces into 2 major formations, a striking force and a fixing force. Now, a brief description of the 2 elements in this defensive task. Fixing force, organized by the commander with the minimum combat power needed to accomplish its mission. The fixing force turns, blocks, and delays the attacking enemy force. It tries to shape the enemy penetration or contain the enemy's advance. Regarding the selection of elements for fixing force, those elements which excel at long-distance marksmanship, coordination with artillery, disciplined action, and steady demeanor are best. Striking force. The striking force contains the maximum combat power available to the commander at the time of its counterattack. The striking force is a combined arms force that has greater combat power and mobility than the force it seeks to defeat or destroy. The commander considers the effects of surprise when determining the relative combat power of the striking force and its targeted enemy unit. The striking force is the key to a successful mobile defense. Selection of elements for this force should attempt, to the maximum level possible, centralized command and control, ideally in a single person to allow for rapid execution and maneuver. Units should not only be cohesive, but must be highly reactive. They should be able to react quickly and decisively to changing circumstances and deliver powerful close-range fires followed by effective bayonet charges in the case of War of Rights. This force, though, must also maintain discipline and not allow its combat power to dissipate in the midst of an offensive action. Another important factor is intelligence preparation of the battlefield, IPB, as well as counter-reconnaissance efforts, especially related to the composition and position of the striking force. The former is to make sure that there is sufficient awareness of enemy positions to successfully attack with the striking force. Regarding the latter, there are some potential techniques that can aid in this effort in War of Rights to achieve this deception. For example, as flag identification and counting is a main method for determining unit location, placing the strike force's flags in other locations may be a useful technique. Some of the general considerations that favor a mobile defense are the following. Number 1. The defender possesses equal or greater mobility than the enemy. Having the ability to rapidly maneuver is essential for the striking force to get into proper positions. Greater firepower can be achieved either through superior weapon systems, in War of Rights such as pistols for cav or bucketball for the 1842s, or to a lesser extent superior training on rapid and accurate fire. The key is to get close and hit the enemy hard and to maximize the use of surprise to magnify combat power. Number 2. The frontage assigned exceeds the defender's capability to establish an effective area or positional defense. This can depend on the size of the server and the size of the map that you're playing on for War Rights, basically meaning the ability to cover all likely avenues of approach with sufficient defenders to prevent exploitation by the attacking force. If you have either a bigger map or fewer units playing on that particular server, a mobile defense may be a more viable strategy. Number 3. The depth of the area of operations allows the attacking enemy force to be drawn into an unfavorable position where it can be attacked. Regarding depth, this can have two manifestations in the game. The first is extending the lines of communication for the enemy force, or in terms of War of Rights, increasing the distance between main spawn and the area of engagement. If a unit is wiped out and loses their flag, their separation due to main spawns gives the defender a major advantage both against the remaining forces as well as further eroding the available time for the attacker in-game. Number 4. The time for preparing defensive positions is limited. In terms of War of Rights, this basically means being able to occupy favorable defensive terrain with loads and bayonets fixed, as well as already either sighting in or moving their pieces into a position to provide fire support to the engagement area as needed. Number 5. The mission does not require denying the enemy specific terrain. Now this one can be a bit tricky, as in, for example, skirmish mode, there is set terrain on the point that must be defended. Now the defender can either set the engagement area before the point comes into play, or, utilizing the counter-attack mechanic, set the engagement area intentionally at the point of contention as the zone where the counterattack will occur. Number 6. The AO lacks well-defined avenues of approach and consists largely of flat, open terrain. Now, I disagree with this application for War of Rights, as we'll see in our example from an in-game event later, but from an actual application it makes sense. The key is not so much as open, flat terrain, which is required for combined arms maneuver, think mechanized infantry, armor, self-propelled artillery, etc., but rather permissive terrain which allows rapid maneuver. In the case of War of Rights, if, for example, you have a lot of obstacles, say fences, between you and the maneuver area, that is considered restrictive terrain and limits your mobility. If, on the other hand, you can utilize concealment, such as through the use of woods or buildings, you can maintain your mobility with the added bonus of maintaining the element of surprise for the counterattack. Now, let's take a look at the opposite end of the spectrum and some of the factors that make mobile defense risky. Number 1. The fixing force may be isolated and defeated in detail because of the need to resource the striking force to the detriment of the fixing force. If the fixing force does not have enough strength to hold the opponent in place, they not only will fail in their mission, but will likely be destroyed and imperil the entire strategy. Number 2. Enemy operations may impair the ability of the striking force to react at critical points. Actions such as spoiling attacks against the striking force may block them and prevent their ability to launch a successful counterattack as needed to destroy the advancing formations. Number 3. The enemy may not move into the area intended by the defending commander. This is especially dangerous in larger maps with multiple avenues of approach. If the fixing force is unable to engage the advancing force in an area that can be struck by the striking force, then the defensive strategy will fail, as the striking force will be rendered useless. Number 4. The attacking enemy force retains at least some momentum as it approaches the desired engagement areas. This is the inverse of the problem of an insufficiently powerful enough fixing force applied to the striking force. If that formation doesn't have enough combat power and fails to eliminate the attacking force targeted, then the defensive strategy will fail, and it will likely easily overpower the fixing force after dealing with the striking force. Number 5. The defending force may not gain an accurate picture of the enemy's locations and dispositions required by the striking force to launch decisive operations in time to react. In this case, if the striking force doesn't find the targeted force, they can waste time and wander away from their target zone, wasting time and, in the worst case, being destroyed in turn by the opposing force, or failing to come to the aid of the fixing force in time to prevent their destruction. Number 6. The decentralized operations required by the mobile defense increase the potential for friendly fire incidents. As the striking force is operating likely in and around the enemy force, it is more likely to be hit by friendly fire. In War of Rights, this may come from either rifle fire from friendlies, but especially from artillery, who may fail to hold fire once the counterattack occurs. The execution of a mobile defense can be divided into 5 steps. The first 3 are shaping operations, while the 4th is the decisive operation. The 5th step, which can only be executed if the 4th was successful, can be classified as a branch or sequel and involves going from the defense onto the offense generally, even if only temporarily. At this point, in addition to looking at the patent example from earlier, we will also look at the actions of the CSA team in the War of Secession event in January on the map Crossroads for further illustration of this in-game. Phase 1. Gain and maintain enemy contact. The commander conducting a mobile defense focuses on discovering the enemy's strength and exact locations to facilitate the effectiveness of the striking force. Further, it determines what routes the enemy is using, where the enemy is strong or weak, and where gaps in and between enemy formations exist. This information aids the commander in seizing the initiative by identifying opportunities. Further, it helps direct the striking force along the path of least resistance as it maneuvers to employ its combat power at the critical time and place. Furthermore, it may be necessary to either entice the enemy force into an engagement area or dissuade them from bypassing it. A commander executing a mobile defense must have the flexibility to yield terrain and shape the enemy penetration. The commander may even entice the enemy by appearing to uncover an objective of strategic or operational value to the enemy. In the case of the patent example, we see the advancing force of the 10th Panzer Division move into a sector of the battlefield, unaware that they were entering into the U.S. engagement area due to sufficient concealment actions by the 2nd Corps. In the example of the Crossroads battle for War of Rights, the initial engagements by the CSA forces were in a forward position along the farmstead area, drawing the USA attackers into their engagement area. Once the CSA fell back, they anchored their forces along a series of fences for additional support, while the wooded area on the CSA right, coupled with the additional visibility obstructions from the buildings, allowed for the force to rapidly maneuver and get the drop on the Union forces. Phase 2. Disrupt the enemy. In a mobile defense, the commander conducts shaping operations designed to shape the enemy's penetration into the MBA, main battle area, and disrupt the enemy's introduction of fresh forces, reserves, and follow-on echelons into the fight. These shaping operations help establish the preconditions for committing the striking force by isolating the object of the striking force and destroying the enemy's key command and control nodes, logistics resupply units, and reserves. In this case, the key is to disrupt the communications and command and control for the attacking force. In the patent example, the use of artillery fire and direct fire support from tank destroyers achieved this effect. In the case of war rights, this can be achieved through artillery fire as well as deliberate targeting of flags and officers to disrupt locks, lines of communications, or respawns, and the ability for units to coordinate both within themselves and among their fellow units. Even getting enemy forces engaged in prolonged firefights, especially independent fire, can have the desired effect, as we see in the case of the Crossroads map. Phase 3. Fix the enemy. Fixing the enemy is the second half of shaping operations and establishes the conditions necessary for decisive operations by the striking force. Typically, the commander of the defending force allows the enemy force to penetrate the main battle area (MBA) before the striking force attacks. The fixing force may employ a combination of area defense, delay, and strong point techniques to shape the enemy's penetration. The intent of the fixing force is not necessarily to defeat the enemy, but to shape the penetration to facilitate a decisive counterattack by the striking force. If Phase 2 is successful, then Phase 3 will naturally follow, as the target is fixed in a location unable to maneuver or react effectively, temporarily, allowing force destruction by the striking force. In the case of the Patton film, this can be seen in the confused movement as the armored infantry are not synced and moving all over the place. Get the one poor bastard getting run over by a tank. The war rights case, again, this can be achieved with rifle fire, but is especially evident as direction of fire and cohesion elapses for a unit, turning it from a formation with offensive potential into a target of destruction. Again, if only temporarily. Phase 4. Maneuver. The defending commander launches the striking force in a counterattack when its offensive power, relative to that of the targeted attacking enemy element, is the greatest. Piecemeal commitment of the striking force in support of local objectives jeopardizes the success of the overall operation. The striking force must execute the counterattack rapidly and violently, employing all combat power necessary to ensure success. The striking force may be committed at a different time than anticipated in an entirely different area than planned. Thus, it must be able to respond to unexpected developments rapidly and decisively. The key to success is to quickly and decisively overwhelm the target of the striking force as completely as possible. Any protracted engagement will make the striking force vulnerable to enemy maneuver. In the case of the Patton film, you see General Bradley ordering the attack coming from the U.S. right flank. In the case of the war rights match, we see Hampton's Legion execute this maneuver repeatedly, often utilizing both the woods and buildings to quickly close with and destroy the enemy forces rapidly, making full use of their buck and ball advantage. Phase 5 followed through. Commanders use defensive actions to create the opportunity to transition to the offense. In a mobile defense, that transitional opportunity generally results from the success of the striking force's attack. The commander exploits success and attempts to establish conditions for a pursuit. If the result of the commander's assessment of the striking force's attack shows there are opportunities for further offensive actions. Now, this assumes a successful execution of Phase 4 and means an opportunity is created for a more general attack. This did not occur in the Patton film, nor historically at El Guettar, nor did it occur in the war rights match at the Crossroads. Although individual attacks were executed by the striking force and successfully wiped out enemy formations with minimal losses to the defender, no general transition to the offensive occurred. In the case of war rights, knocking out enemy formations, especially on larger maps with far away spawn points, including eliminating flags, create conditions for acute but fleeting advantages for the defenders. These temporary advantages gained through a mobile defense can allow for a major offensive with local superiority and often with the benefit of being in a position to offer flanking support from the striking force. Ideally, this could allow for the elimination of other enemy formations or potentially an entire rout of a full enemy force, wiping out all of their flags and forcing them back to their main spawn. This situation can be ideal as it either will force the attacker to wait for their flags to respawn at main, wasting loads of time and allowing the defenders to fully reset, or result in a piecemeal attack that is uncoordinated and often without the support of flags to respawn. This can allow for rapid elimination of these weaker forces and allow the defenders to gain an acute advantage. However, the window for such an opportunity is always fleeting and requires a sufficiently successful execution of the maneuver phase of the mobile defense. And that concludes today's lesson. Let me know what you thought of my outline in the comments, and also let me know of any examples of mobile defense that you have seen executing War of Rights. This is Kotow, and thanks for watching the Officer Basic Course.